Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this informational session on the UK-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. I'm Chelsea Rapp. I'm the chairperson of the New Zealand Game Developers Association. I'm also the program manager for UC's Digital Screen Campus, and I'll be your MC for this webinar today. We're going to start with a presentation from Wendy Matthews, which will give an overview of the goods outcomes. And that'll be followed by a Q&A session. We have a number of subject leads online today who are here to answer your questions on a range of topics related to the UK FTA, including services, investment, IP, digital trade, and government procurement. You won't be able to turn on your video or unmute yourselves during the webinar, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A function throughout the webinar. You can submit any questions that you have by using that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and then we will answer those as many as we can with the time that we have. This session is being recorded and may be uploaded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade website for anybody who couldn't make it online today. So we'll start with the presentation by Wendy. Wendy Matthews is the manager of the Trade Policy and Negotiations Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Her division is responsible for negotiating agreements, including the UK and EU free trade agreements and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or the DEPA. Her previous roles in the ministry include ambassador to Vietnam and the unit manager for MFAT Services Investment and Digital Unit. Wendy is also New Zealand's DEPA lead negotiator. Take it away, Wendy.
Well, first of all, can I say a huge thank you to Chelsea for giving up your time to facilitate this seminar. We're really pleased to have you on board, and I am really pleased that there are some great outcomes that we can talk about in the FTA. So, tēnā koutou katoa. I am here to talk about the UK FTA primarily with my team, but I did also want to acknowledge that we, on the 30th of June, announced the conclusion of another very large and very important FTA, and that is the EU FTA. The topic that we're going to talk about today is around services, around digital, around IP, government procurement and investment. And I would say for both the UK FTA and the EU FTA, there are some really outstanding outcomes in the area. In the EU FTA, we will have reach to a 450 million high-value consumers, which is really important, I know, for our services. But the primary focus of today is the UK FTA, which we launched in June 2020, the negotiations, and in what is for trade negotiations quite a sprint, we conclude them within years. We're really proud of the outcomes, and a few weeks ago we outlined the goods outcomes in a similar webinar, and as I said, this one is much more focused on the on some of the other elements. I am joined by Jonas here, who leads on intellectual property, but we also have our great negotiators, some joining us from Tokyo, Sam on services, Tom on investment. We have Richard Lee joining us on government procurement, and Claire Kibblewhite on digital. So as you can imagine, it takes quite a team to build and negotiate a and some real expertise. So direct all your hard questions to them. I'm just going to outline some of the key points, but we already have some great questions. I really encourage you to drill down. We also have a wealth of material on our website, and we very much encourage you to reach out with email questions anytime. So this UK FTA sets really high ambition in the services area, and we have a very significant suite of outcomes. We have chapters on cross-border trade and services, financial services, domestic regulation, telecommunications, and temporary entry of business persons. In addition, there's also commitments on professional and business services, express delivery services, and international maritime services. So just to kick off with professional and business services, many you'll be aware that given the similarity in the UK and New Zealand systems, there's already some excellent cooperation between our professional bodies. And what this commitment does is sets forward a work program to further that cooperation, in particular around professional qualifications, recognition and registration. Professional registration to further that cooperation that's already happening and to try and nudge it along a bit to allow ease of our professionals operating in the UK market. We also have an ambitious financial services chapter, which sets out a range of commitments, really to give certainty to our financial service exporters and to our fintech exporters, which I'm sure many of you know is a fantastically growing area in New Zealand. These commitments are balanced with policy space as well, that we retain the right to have a financial system that is stable and governed by good regulation. In regard to temporary entry of business persons, there's greater facilitation of visas, particularly for specified areas. These are intra-corporate transferees, installers and services, independent professionals, business visitors and contractual service suppliers. So it sets out some base level commitments and some commitments around ensuring that these processes are transparent and expedited. In addition, you may have seen alongside the FTA that in early July, the Prime Minister, when she visited the UK, inked a deal to further the youth mobility scheme. So this is now, the age range is expanded up to 35. I think it's 18 to 35 years. The length of it has increased from 2 years to 3 years. The numbers for this are, there are 13,000 Kiwis who can access these visas annually and 15,000 British youth who can access the visas into New Zealand. So alongside the FTA, that's a great outcome for ensuring that mobility of our talent. The FTA delivers some really great outcomes for Māori. These are weaved within the FTA in terms of the goods, services, outcomes, but also some references in the preamble and in the Māori Trade and Economic Cooperation chapter that are around acknowledging the particular role that the Te Tiriti o Waitangi has in New Zealand's constitution and this also reflects, of course, our relationship with the UK. In addition, there are a number of provisions that support Māori accessing the benefits of the FTA and supporting that growth of Māori enterprise. The FTA includes modern investment provisions, which are really around creating certainty, transparency, for investors in each jurisdiction. The UK investors will have access to a preferential screening threshold, which is 200 million New Zealand dollars, in line with the preferential treatment that we have provided to some other New Zealand FTA partners. Alongside this, there is no investor-state dispute settlement, which is current New Zealand policy. So there is, however, a state-to-state dispute settlement mechanism contained within the FTA to resolve any issues should they arise. There are government procurement commitments which build on our WTO GPA commitments. And there's some particular references in the chapter text on government procurement around facilitating SMEs to access government procurement, which is a great advance on the WTO sort of baseline. There are, alongside this, again, some policy space for New Zealand to be able to continue to leverage procurement to enhance economic, social, cultural and environmental outcomes. And at this stage, the chapter is in relation to central government procurement, but there is possibility for ongoing discussions around subsectors beyond that. We have, as I mentioned before, a digital trade chapter which supports a range of elements. First of all, the basic facilitating all trade, including e-certification, recognition of e-signatures and e-invoicing. It includes protections for consumers, including preventing spam. And then the core data transfer provisions, including prevention of requirements for data localization. And finally, I'll turn to Jonas's area, intellectual property, where there is, under the FTA, we've agreed to establish an artist resale right scheme. And we have agreed to extend the copyright term by 20 years for authors, performers and producers. However, in the FTA, there's no changes to our patent or data protection rules. There is a link to the EU FTA in relation to geographic indications, in that there's no upfront commitments in the in the UK FTA on geographic indicators, but as we have now agreed geographic indications in the EU FTA, we will be discussing with the UK how we can incorporate some of those outcomes into the UK. So finally, on next steps. So when this agreement is going to come into force is very important to us, and we're trying to move it along as fast as we can. In the New Zealand context, we had the first reading of our UK FTA bill on Wednesday, and we're working very hard with our counterparts to try and move agreement along into implementation stage. We are hopeful that this can be done by the end of the year, but there is still a lot of work to do both in New Zealand and in the UK to ensure that's happening. So with that, that's a quick run through some of the highlights, and really looking forward to hearing your questions. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for that, Wendy. Now we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A part of this webinar. And again, I'd like to encourage everybody, if you have any questions that you haven't asked yet or haven't been addressed, please feel free to use the Q&A part feature at the bottom of the screen, which will allow you to submit your questions for the panel. If there are any questions that we can't answer online today, officials will take these away to answer in writing. To start us off, we have a few questions that were already pre-submitted, so we'll go ahead and start with those. The first question is for Richard. Can you please provide some more info on how the government procurement chapter will benefit businesses?
That's great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. So government procurement chapters, effectively, they secure principles and procedural disciplines around procurement practices, which ensure that the government procurement markets are transparent and are trade facilitative. And this benefits New Zealand suppliers exporting overseas because it provides greater access to effectively central and sub-central government. The UK market presents quite a large opportunity for New Zealand because its annual spend is about £300 billion, and the government buy a whole wide range of things, and this supports New Zealand diversifying its export profile as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. This next question is for Sam. Sam, what are the changes to Investment/Overseas Investment Act?
Thank you. So the UK FTA will support two-way investment between both countries. It will increase transparency in the processes for how an investment can be made. In terms of UK investors into New Zealand, the Overseas Investment Act screening regime threshold has been increased to $200 million. So that's the level at which a UK investor will now need to apply to the Overseas Investment Office. We also, the changes from the FTA won't affect the government's recent changes to the Overseas Investment Act relating to the national security call-in power that have recently been put in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. This next question is for Jonas. Jonas, what does the UK FTA mean for copyright?
Well, kia ora koutou, thanks for that. So as Wendy mentioned, an important change coming out of the UK FTA is the increase in copyright term by 20 years for all works. So for most works that we know of, literary works, artistic works, this means that the copyright term will now be the remaining life of the author plus 70 years rather than the life of the author plus 50 years. But for works that aren't determined on the life of the author, such as sound recordings, we simply increase them from the current 50 years to 70 years. Under the UK FTA, we agreed a 15-year period before we had to make these changes. This has somewhat been superseded by the recent EU FTA agreement, where we have the same commitments, but have agreed that we will implement these changes within 4 years of that agreement coming into force. So a substantially shorter time than we agreed with the UK. And the other changes on copyright, there's a technical change to the extent of rights that a performer holds in their sound recordings. Those rights will also now apply in relation to the playing of those sound recordings in public rather than the broadcast of those sound recordings. And then finally, a related issue, which is often captured by copyright, is the artist resale right, which Wendy mentioned. So New Zealand, within 2 years of the agreement coming into force, will implement an artist resale rights, which will, provide effectively a royalty payment to artists on the sale of their art, the sale of their artworks in the secondary market. So not the first sale, but if it's later sold, and work's underway to bring in those changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. This next question is for Tom. What benefits are there for software development companies and those looking to set up an office in the UK versus, say, the EU?
Thank you. That's a great question. Just checking to make sure I'm actually... Sorry, apologies. I have slight technical issues here. So that's a great question. The UK FTA has quite ambitious commitments in the temporary entry for business persons category. So what that basically means is that we have commitments that specifically allow for the establishment of businesses in the UK and allows those senior business people who are working in those enterprises to obtain visas for up to 3 months per year and go to the UK to establish those businesses, which is something that the UK has doesn't often commit to in its FTAs, and has been quite a significant change in its current practice. So it's great for our businesses because it means that they will be able to secure those visas, set up their companies, and then once there, they'll be able to have the benefits, the certainty and the transparency on the rules and treatment that the FTA provides to ensure they continue to grow their business in the UK. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Back to you, Richard. Will the UK FTA mean that New Zealand becomes inundated with foreign suppliers bidding for government contracts?
The short answer is no. New Zealand already operates quite a transparent non-discrimination regime as it is. And I don't think much will change. One reason why that is because New Zealand, it does need to buy goods and services from overseas. We do produce a lot of great things here, but we can't produce everything. And I think really existing arrangements and existing opportunities will remain.
Fantastic, thank you. Again, just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit, please feel free to use that, that Q&A feature. Again, that's just at the bottom of the screen. The next question is for Jonas. Are there any implications from the NZ-EU FTA relevant to the UK FTA, particularly in the areas of product protection and GIs?
Thank you. So, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, that the change in the copyright, how much time we have to bring in the copyright changes is a direct link between the two agreements. The other one, which Wendy also mentioned, is in relation to the geographical indications. So these are names like champagne that identify products from a certain area that have certain quality because of where they come from. So this is a really important part of the discussion with the EU. The UK have similar interests in the protection of GIs, but we didn't address that in their agreement directly, in part because we were talking to the EU about it at the same time. But we did agree with the UK that if we entered into another international agreement that dealt with GIs, and we were all thinking about the EU FTA, we would come back and sit down and talk to the UK about how, whether we can bring those benefits across to the UK agreement. So it's effectively an agreement to sit down and negotiate, and an agreement to agree, which we will need to do after two things happen. Once the UK FTA is in force in New Zealand, which shouldn't be too far away, and once the EU FTA has been signed by both parties. So the recent agreement with the EU is an agreement in principle. As to the final agreement, we need to go through legal scrub and other matters. So there's a bit of time before that process with the UK starts, but we will be talking to the UK about their geographical indications and the protection of New Zealand geographical indications in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Wendy, these next two questions are for you. First, do we know whether a new UK government will cause any delay or relitigation of the free trade agreement?
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask who was going to win the upcoming leadership battle, but I mean, first of all, it is the same party who it is a leadership discussion rather than a change of government. So we can assume that the same priorities will remain under the new leadership, and some of the candidates, I'm sure you know, were previously heavily involved in the UK FTA as well. So in terms of timeframes, New Zealand, as I mentioned, is working really hard to put the UK FTA through our legislative process, and there's good progress there. And we have seen that similarly on the UK side, they are making really good progress, and they have put the FTA bill through their parliament as well. So we are seeing good traction on both sides. There may be some delays given that there will be a legislative slowdown on the UK side, but given their current political process, but I would not expect that to be a significant.
And when will the Australian UK FTA enter into force compared to the New Zealand UK FTA?
Another good question, and certainly we have been very keen to ensure that the two processes are aligned, and so that our exporters are getting the benefits at the same time the Australian exporters are getting the benefits of their deal. The UK has put the two FTAs together in their legislative process, so we will enter into force at the same time. And the current bill that I mentioned in the UK Parliament was submitted, and it will progress at the same time as the Australian.
Thank you so much, Wendy. This next question is for you, Claire. What does the digital trade chapter actually do for New Zealand business?
Thanks, Chelsea, for the question, and kia ora, everyone. It's a good question, and I guess I would build on the points that Wendy made in her presentation to say, you know, at a high level, the digital chapter sets out a range of commitments and disciplines that aim to support all trade as well as digital trade. So there are four kind of key categories that you find in the digital trade chapter. The first is promoting user confidence in digital trade. So this is things like preventing spam, as well as protecting personal information and privacy. The second is looking at ways and systems to improve interoperability between partners to help facilitate digital trade. So these are things like interoperability of e-invoicing systems, promoting paperless ways of trading, recognizing e-contracts, that sort of thing. The third is avoiding unnecessary barriers to digital trade. So this is really related to the cross-border transfer of information between parties and preventing things like undue localization requirements. And finally, the digital trade chapter also has a broad range of cooperation mechanisms between the parties, as well as mechanisms that are focused on supporting digital inclusion. So this is making sure that we can work together to ensure that, you know, all members of communities, our communities, have access to the benefits of digital trade. Thanks.
Kia ora, Claire. This next question is for you, Tom. How will the FTA support New Zealand software as a service companies trading online and or setting up a physical operation in the UK?
Thanks. That's a great and very detailed question. I mean, the FTA provides a series of commitments in a range of areas that will help all of our service providers as they try to operate in the UK market. It provides transparency by locking in the rules and treatment they receive as it currently is, and ensures that it can't be changed in a way that might negatively impact them later on. So that applies for everybody, including software development companies. It also allows for greater flow of senior staff between New Zealand and the UK, which will allow those companies operating in offshore in the UK to be able to send their senior management along to help set up, or once set up and established, to be able to operate and manage and run those companies. So there are quite a few benefits, but there aren't that many that are specific to software companies per se. It's more the general suite of benefits that will help them through having greater regulatory certainty, greater ease of access into the market, and commitments to be treated in a manner that's similar to how other foreign software companies that operate in the UK, particularly those that already have FTAs, and also commitments that will ensure they get treated similar to UK companies operating in the same area in the UK. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. This next question is for Jonas. Given the extension of copyright duration in the FTE, what are the plans for restarting the Copyright Act review?
Thanks for that. Yes, so some of you will know that the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment had been running a comprehensive review of the Copyright Act, which, as many would say, is overdue, which was paused in part because of the ongoing FTA discussions. I was talking to MB colleagues again today. A decision by the Minister of Consumer Affairs hasn't been taken on when that process would reopen. But MB did note that they'll be putting out a pānui to copyright stakeholders on that, hopefully in August, so there'll be more information coming on that. I would just add that, I mean, I think the government is well aware that although a number of stakeholders were very enthusiastic about copyright term extension in New Zealand, there are other sectors that have real concerns, including from the library and museum sector, education. The 4 years that we now have from entry into force of the EU FTA will give us time, or will give the government time, to respond to some of those concerns and look for mitigations that can lessen the impact of extended copyright term, particularly for those sectors. I would say it's well acknowledged that work needs to be done alongside the work that will need to be done to implement these changes in the copyright legislation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonas. And thank you to everybody who's been submitting their questions through that Q&A feature. Again, if you have any questions, you can use the link or the feature right there at the bottom. And try as we can, let's try to keep those questions focused on the topic of today's webinar and the experts that we have available. This next question is for Sam. Will it also be easier for families of business people to travel to the UK or vice versa?
Thanks. Good question. Yes, it will. So for people moving to the UK as intra-corporate transferees, so moving to the same company in the UK, their families and dependents will also be eligible for a visa to stay for the same period that the transferee is also staying for. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. This next question is for Claire. Does the FTA change the UK GDPR requirements and compliance in any way?
Thanks, Chelsea, for the question. Good question. I guess as a broad point, the UK FTA does not impact GDPR requirements. What the FTA does do, though, is put in place commitments around the free flow of data, as well as commitments on the protection of personal information. So these commitments require the parties to have in place a legal framework governing the protection of personal information for the users of digital trade, for example. They also include important principles the two sides expect to see as part of a robust personal information protection framework. I guess if businesses have specific questions about how they might comply with regulations, probably the best thing to do is to consult the relevant privacy frameworks in New Zealand and in the UK as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Back to you, Richard, for this one. Does the UK FTA prevent the government from buying New Zealand companies?
I'm going to interpret that to mean, is there anything to prevent the New Zealand government from, purchasing or engaging with New Zealand businesses and suppliers for goods and services, and nothing in the FTA. There's nothing in the FTA that would prevent this. In fact, it's highly encouraged in New Zealand's current systems and policy settings. There are rules around encouraging New Zealand businesses to have access to government contracts, and those will still remain and are absolutely permissible under the commitments we've made in this agreement.
Thanks, Richard. Jonas, this next question is for you. Is New Zealand changing its patent or data protection rules in relation to pharmaceuticals, agricultural chemicals, or veterinary medicines?
Thanks for the question. As Wendy mentioned, an important outcome of the UK FTA is that we aren't making changes to those rules. So those rules would provide additional protection for inventors of new pharmaceuticals, agricultural chemicals, and veterinary medicines. We aren't changing those rules. And the same outcome, we achieve the same outcome in the EU FTA. So these are important for New Zealand as it avoided significant costs that could have otherwise occurred under either of the negotiations, and leaves policy space for New Zealand to make its own determination about those rules. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Jonas. Appreciate this next question is for Wendy. We appreciate that webinars are useful. Are you planning on doing any in-person engagements this year, though?
Yes, the answer is a resounding yes, and we're very much looking forward to having some more face-to-face encounters, but also getting out into the region. So please look out for future roadshows where we will be talking about the outcomes of the UK and the EPA, and also answering questions more broadly on trade policy. We're very keen to get out and about as COVID restrictions allow us, and in particular to get out into some of the regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. All right, so we're approaching the end of the questions. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to submit them again using that Q&A feature at the bottom. If there aren't any additional questions, then we'll go ahead and start wrapping up. I think we have one coming through. All right, so we have another question for Jonas. What was the evidence used by New Zealand negotiators for increased cost for pharmaceuticals? Cost for pharmaceuticals from increased IP terms, modeling data only?
We commissioned, we worked with Pharmac and commissioned an economic analysis of costs associated with pharmaceutical patent term extension. We also commissioned some work in relation to agricultural chemicals and veterinary medicines. And of course, worked closely with Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, the IP policy team there, who this is their business, and with MPI on those costs. So we had economic modelling on those costs, plus policy insight on those costs, in deciding to leave a sales policy room and not agree to those changes in the agreement.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonas. And thank you to everybody for joining us today and the questions that you all submitted. Your continued engagement is really important as the team moves through the ratification process. So please remember, if you have any additional questions, you can contact the team at ukfta@mfat.govt.nz. Ka kite, and we'll see you all next time.